Greetings, OHL fans, and by extension, fans of the OHL podcast. How do you like round two so far? Yeah, a sweep, London over Erie, but we sort of expected the Knights to have a fairly easy time with that one. The Oshawa Generals get it done over the Brantford Bulldogs, so the top seed in the East is out, and we have two Game 7s to look forward to on the day that you are listening to this episode. Barrie at home to Kingston, Windsor at home to the Kitchener Rangers. And speaking of at home, our good friend and colleague Dan Mahar here from the OHL podcast had family matters to attend to. It is the long Easter weekend after all, so you're stuck with me just as we get underway. But don't worry, a closer look at the Eastern Conference finalist, Oshawa Generals, later on in this episode of the OHL podcast, when we're joined by an old friend of mine, Jack Moore, who calls the games for the Gens. Before we get there, some things just to touch on, maybe call it a little bit of housekeeping as we get another episode underway. One of those things is reporting from RDS out of Montreal that CHL teams will have access to maybe 3 import players as early as next season. As you probably know, there are only 2 import slots in the Ontario Hockey League right now. And I've never listened. The import draft itself has long been made fun of as not so much of a draft as a prearranged situation where teams get the players that they want to get because these arrangements have been made in advance, and it is what it is. I'm not really sure, and I don't like coming to you with kind of the picket fence stuck in my derriere, but I'm not sure where I really land on this. I certainly want the Ontario Hockey League and the Canadian Hockey League to offer the best of the best to its fans. And so by that logic, you'd want to have the very best players from wherever in the world it is that they're coming from. But then the nationalist in me, if you will, thinks about the changing landscape in the CHL with the new NCAA rule agreement and how we've seen the most recent OHL draft go. And we've seen more American players being drafted by Canadian Hockey League teams because they know they might come here for a little bit and then go over to the NCAA or vice versa. So if we're already taking in more Americans to the league and now we're going to take in more European players as imports, what spaces are we leaving on our teams for the players competing here in Ontario, for example, in the Alliance Hockey Organization or in the GTHL or in the Northern Ontario Hockey Associations, et cetera, et cetera. The kids in our communities in the Ontario Hockey League are trying for the same opportunities that we're creating for American-born players, players with NCAA commitments, and now European imports as well. In and of itself, like I'm not trying to get all political here, like I said, too nationalistic on all of this, but there's a part of me that's just not entirely sure that 3 imports is absolutely necessary. I guess we'll see how it plays out, and I'm sure that I will arrive somewhere, somehow, at a firmer stance on this. But right now, I'm a little bit unsure of exactly how I feel, but first blush is just that. Are we taking away too many spaces from the kids right here that we're raising, that we're watching in rinks across Ontario and small towns that also have the aspirations to play in the Ontario Hockey League or across this country in the Canadian Hockey League, just by opening up more spots for imports? In Barrie, news this past week that there has been a 15-year lease agreement reached at the Sadlin Arena for the Colts to continue playing. Remember, this is a municipally owned arena, so the city of Barrie controls the arena. The Barrie Colts lease space there. 15 more years of the Colts at the Sadlin Arena in Barrie. First off, I love this for the stability of the organization, right? What more could you ask for? It's very similar to what we're talking about in Brantford when that new arena deal is, what's been announced. They're going to build the new arena. The Bulldogs will be the tenants for 15 years, and then there are five-year extensions that can be added to that for a total of 40, et cetera. You want the stability in the market, and the Colts already have a nice long history in the market. So extend that history, add 15 years to it, give the fans, give the organization the stability. I love that, first and foremost. But what I don't love, if we're being honest here, is the Sadlin Arena, right? It's a wee bit on the tired side. It's not exactly the modern day Ontario Hockey League rink that we're all looking for / hoping for. Capacity right around 4,200, so just over 4,000. That's not enough to ever be in the running to host the Memorial Cup. But not that the Colts have shown a whole heck of a lot of interest in that. I can't remember the last time, if ever, they've bid, but you got to have a 5,000 seat arena in order to do that. I'm led to believe that there is some conversation happening in Barrie around some upgrades at the arena. I would describe those as much needed upgrades, not only from the fan experience, but really what we have to think about now in this new world, right? And Dan and I have talked about this on the podcast in the very recent past. It's a full court press now when it comes to recruitment in the Ontario Hockey League. The teams that are the haves are going to start strutting their have status and making it very attractive for players to come here from all sorts of things in terms of their development, right? What kind of coaching is in place? What kind of opportunity will they have? How big a crowd will they play in front of? And oh, yeah, what does the facility look like that they're playing in, that they're training in, etc.? And the Sadlin Arena has got some work to do in that regard. Again, I've been told that there is conversation already happening, which is great, that there will be some upgrades made. Let's find a way to get some more seats in there, bring it up to 5,000 plus, give them the chance if they'd ever like to compete for that Memorial Cup bid. But more than anything, bring this arena that's just feels a little dated for the modern player and the modern league, bring it up to snuff and make it a really desirable place for players to come. Look, you can say from the success on the ice, it certainly is that. Credit to Marty Williamson and the team there, who have done a terrific job again this year. They're one of those teams going to the Game 7, as I mentioned earlier. Colts taking on Kingston for all the marbles in their Eastern Conference semifinal for the right to go on and play Oshawa. But the success on the ice in Barrie has been pretty consistent. They've had some high caliber players through there and some reasonable success on the ice. So lots to like about this in terms of the stability and the continuation of that success. But for my money, you've got to get the arena upgraded somewhat and then be ready for the recruitment battle that is only beginning to brew in the Ontario Hockey League. Staying in the East for just a moment, and again, when Jack Moore joins us from the Oshawa Generals, we'll do a deeper dive into the East. But you got to feel a little bit for the Brantford Bulldogs this season, and really the fans in Brantford, who we know have been among the most passionate, smallest market now, smallest arena in the league, and they pack that barn, the Brantford and District Civic Arena. They get behind the Bulldogs. They've embraced OHL hockey again in Brantford, which I love as a guy that's been around long enough to remember the Brantford Alexanders, right? But it's tough. It's tough when you're up 2-0 in a playoff series and arguably your best player, certainly your leading goal scorer in Nick Lardis, gets injured and knocked out for the remainder of the series. So what's happening here? Well, you're robbing the Brantford Bulldogs of their best chance. And I know one player does not make a team and nobody in Brantford is going to be making excuses for this, but the reality is the reality, isn't it? And Nick Lardis scored himself 71 regular season goals. The game in which he was injured, he had already recorded a hat trick to propel the Bulldogs to their Game 2 win over Oshawa. Then he gets knocked out. And so the team loses, obviously, because he's not there for the rest of the series, and the Bulldogs lose the next 4 in a row. The fans in Brantford are robbed of that. And frankly, Ontario Hockey League fans are robbed of a high caliber player and what he shows us when the games matter the most in the playoffs. And I think that's a loss for all of us. And where I'm struggling here, and I talked about this on Fridays with Farwell. If you ever watch that on our YouTube channel, thank you. And I kind of got into this last week. Look, I don't think Andrew Gibson is a terrible person, but I do think what Andrew Gibson did in his knee-on-knee collision with Nick Lardis is very similar to what Andrew Gibson did during the World Junior Hockey Championship that many Canadian hockey fans saw and were upset about when it cost Team Canada an important 2 minutes in the penalty box late in a game where Team Canada was trying to stay alive. For whatever reason, Andrew Gibson chose to lead with the knee. I've never really understood that. I think you're putting yourself as the person doing the hitting at as much risk as the person getting hit. And now we all, of course, know the result, right? Lardis gets knocked out of the series. Gibson gets a 2-game suspension, and Oshawa goes on to win the series in 6. The Bulldogs don't win again in Lardis's absence. But even more than how anybody feels about Andrew Gibson, and I have no ill will. I think that this is a habit he might want to break, kind of leading with the knee on these sorts of checks. But one of the things that's bothered me the most about this, aside from any hockey fan's loss of seeing Nick Lardis perform in the playoffs, is this idea that somehow Nick Lardis is at fault for the injury because he tried to dodge the hit. First of all, who among us wouldn't try to? But really, when you're saying the player that tried to get out of the way of the hit is as responsible, if not more responsible, for the injury than the person delivering the hit, think of it this way, okay? Yes, you should look both ways before you cross the street. Even if you're crossing at a signalized intersection or a stop sign or some other place where the vehicles on that street are supposed to stop, you sure, still look both ways before you do that, okay? But if you don't and you're walking across when you have the right of way and the person driving the vehicle comes blowing through that red light or that stop sign and runs you over, it ain't on you. You know what I'm saying here? And so to blame the victim in this, like, oh, you shouldn't have tried to get out of the way. You should have just absorbed the blow. That is one of the most ridiculous arguments I think that I have ever heard. And it would only possibly, in my opinion, have come from a partisan lens, fans of the Oshawa Generals. Be a fan of the Oshawa Generals, okay? But be disappointed that all of us were robbed of seeing more of Nick Lardis. And give your head a shake, kindly, if you are in any way contributing to the narrative that Nick Lardis is in any way at fault for what happened to him. It is on the onus of responsibility, completely on the player that was delivering the hit, i.e., Andrew Gibson in this case. Full stop. I wish the Gens the best of luck the rest of the way. I wish Nick Lardis a speedy recovery and a return to full health because he's got a promising pro career ahead of him. But it was a disappointing part of that series, and I have zero time for any suggestion that Nick Lardis is in any way responsible for what happened to him. One other point I just want to touch on before we get to our conversation with Jack Moore. And I'm sorry that Dan can't be here to see this too, our usual co-host on this podcast, because I got myself, after getting a Cornwall Royals jersey and a Belleville Bulls jersey, I have now added the jersey that you are seeing if you're watching on the YouTube channel. And don't worry if you're not, I can describe it to you. It is an Antonino's original pizza. Antonino's since 1959, Antonino's Pizza in Windsor. I will confess that I was many years too old when I finally learned of the beauty that is Windsor pizza. Best ding dang pizza I have ever tasted anywhere, and I've gone through a few of the big ones in Windsor, but the best by far, Antonino's. I found it years ago. I go every chance I get when I'm in Windsor to have some Antonino's pizza. And as luck would have it, they overheard my passion for Antonino's pizza and they said, hey, Farwell, you need to have an Antonino's original pizza hockey jersey of your own. And so here it is. Here we are. I'm loving it. And I had to represent on the podcast this week. It is so I am licking my chops just thinking of the chance to have some Antonino's pizza when I go back to Windsor for Game 7, Rangers Spitfires on Tuesday night, just like the London Knights are licking their chops watching the Rangers and Spitfires go to Game 7. London, of course, getting through in the minimum number of games so far, sweeping Owen Sound, sweeping Erie, and if you'll remember, the final game of that series that London won in overtime over the Otters, Martin Misiak couldn't go for Erie because, according to game reports, he had taken too many heavy hits earlier in the series. Little banged up. We know London likes to play a heavy game. They do play that heavy game. They exact a toll on their opponents. They've been resting for about a week while Windsor and Kitchener continue to play, continue to expend energy. You know the Knights are licking their chops at the chance to have one of these slightly more fatigued teams. So what's the winner get? Who takes Game 7 between Windsor and Kitchener? The chance to play the mighty, mighty London Knights in the Western Conference Final. Oh, fun for one of those teams. And Antonino's Original Pizza in Windsor. Thanks for the hockey jersey, and thanks for making the best pie I have ever tasted. Hands down, no exaggeration. Absolutely love it. And I think it's so fun that they heard about my love for it and threw this hockey jersey my way so I could represent it on the OHL podcast. Even in Dan Mahar's absence, remember, even if you want to chirp him about taking the long Easter weekend, government workers, eh? You can. He's on Twitter or X at his name, at Dan Mahar. I am at Farwell _OHL on X. And we love the interaction with you. Drop an email anytime, ohlpodcast@rogers.com. Let us know where you're listening from, something that you're interested in. If we get something right, if we get something wrong, you know how to find us. All right, we're going to take a closer look at the Eastern Conference finalist, Oshawa Generals, in our next segment. We're also going to get some stories that should have been told sooner about the late, great, legendary Don Cameron, who called more than 4,000 games with the Kitchener Rangers and had a tie to every one of those Rangers teams from 1963 through his passing in 2018. Don would have turned 89 this past week. Those stories, Performer of the Week, and more still to come on this week's episode of the OHL Podcast. The NBA 82-game grind is done, and now the real fun begins. The NBA playoffs are here, and it's time for all the high-stakes drama, clutch moments, and jaw-dropping plays. I can't wait. If you're looking to make the playoffs even more exciting, DraftKings Sportsbook has you covered as an official sports betting partner of the NBA. Try placing a bet on your favorite player's performance. Will they drop 30 points, 40, or more? It's your call. And here's something for first-timers. New DraftKings customers bet $5 to get $200 in bonus bets instantly. Make it a playoff run to remember with DraftKings Sportsbook. Download the DraftKings Sportsbook app and use code THPN. That's code THPN for new customers to get $200 in bonus bets when you bet just $5. Only on DraftKings. The crown is yours. Well, we've got 2 Game 7s coming up to close out our second round of these OHL playoffs, just like my podcast partner Dan Mahar predicted. He called it the best second round in a decade. Maybe so. London gets by in the sweep. We already talked about that. Rangers Spits playing a Game 7. Barrie Kingston playing a Game 7. And a team that got through in 6. The Oshawa Generals, who lost the first 2, then came back and won the next 4 from the Brantford Bulldogs. And the voice of the Oshawa Generals, Jack Moore, and a good old friend, makes time to join us on this week's episode of the OHL Podcast. Jackson, how does it feel headed back to the East Final?
You know what? I think that I didn't realize how much stress there was sitting on my shoulders until Owen Griffin put one into an empty net with 8 seconds to go. And I just felt the release of it. Like, okay, we don't have to go to Game 7. We don't have to push this one more. There's going to be a little time off here, and we get to, rest and recovery and reset for whoever we're going to play in the Eastern Conference Final. But it feels good. And, I think that just the way the season kind of went for Oshawa, not the best start, 2-5-1 to begin the year. There's question marks. Beckett Seneca comes back and he's pointless in his first 3 games, and Colby Barlow doesn't have a point in his first 6 games with the Generals. Callum Ritchie's still with Colorado. And then Oshawa seemingly figures it out, and they go into London, and they're down 3-0 in a game, and it's, oh my goodness, we got London tonight, and then we got Saginaw tomorrow night. And Oshawa pulls off the comeback, 2 power play goals in the second to make it 3-2 going into the third, and then 3 in the third period, including Beckett Seneca with what I still think is the goal of the year, and at least the OHL, maybe the Canadian Hockey League, to cap that one off and win it 5-3. But then the Generals turn around the next night and lose 6-1 to Saginaw, and less than 48 hours later, they have a different head coach, and they're 18-1-1, and they're in first place in the division. And then Callum Ritchie leaves for the World Juniors, and he's gone for a month and a half. He comes back, and things just seemingly don't click. The power play struggles. They couldn't score goals down the stretch. Jacob Oster had a rocky start to the season, but he gets better, but he's not getting goal support, and the team's just kind of fumbling their way through the last month of the season. And you end up in fourth, and you got to play Porter Martone, Carson Rakoff, Jack Ivankovic, Connor Smith in the first round against the Brampton Steelheads. And Oshawa was able to pull that one out in 6. And then congratulations, you get the Brantford Bulldogs, the East Division champs and the Eastern Conference regular season champs in the second round. And you're down 0-2, and Andrew Gibson gets suspended. And I know the Bulldogs lost Nick Lardis, which was horrible, but credit to the Generals for, with their backs against the wall, fighting through it. And I think, what can't be not unsaid about this team is that experience that they got from last year. They got swept in the OHL final, but this is a team that lost 3 straight in the Eastern Conference final when they had a 3-0 lead and found a way to win a game 7 to get to the OHL Championship Series. So the experience that a bulk of these guys who are carrying the load, Owen Griffin, Beckett Seneca, Callum Ritchie, Luca Morelli, Ben Danford, Zach Sandu, the guys who have been here, played in those games, Luke Torrance, Matthew Buckley, that are back with the team this year, and they're showing that playoff experience is huge here, and they found a way, and now they're resetting, and it's a new series going to start later this week.
So you touched on it, Jack. Down the stretch, maybe not the best March, maybe not a March that the Oshawa Generals wanted. I'm on the other side of the league covering the Western Conference, and I'm a moron at the best of times, but I took the quote unquote upset. Porter Martone, Carson Rakoff, Jack Ivankovic, and the Brampton Steelheads, the 5 seed. I thought they would squeak past Oshawa because I didn't love Oshawa's last month. Clearly, I was wrong. I had Brantford in 7 in round number 2. Clearly, I was wrong again. How did I get it so wrong, Jack?
Well, just pick against them in the Eastern Conference Final in the OHL Championship Series, and I think we're going to get along just fine here, Mike. I think with Oshawa, a lot of the things that you can look at, especially in the first 2 rounds of the series, I think ultimately what was the undoing of the other teams was the depth. And I think Oshawa's ability to roll 12 forwards at points, but mostly 9 forwards that have effects on the game. You look at the third line when they're fully healthy. Brooks Rogowski missed game 6. We'll see what his status is moving forward here. But you have a third line of Brooks Rogowski, Lowry Sinovori, and Matthew Buckley, who can affect the game, like really good forecheckers, really strong defensively, and have the ability to put the puck in the back of the net. Matthew Buckley scored the game winner in game number 4 on a play where Brooks Rogowski dug it out of the corner. Lowry Sinovori's made a number of incredible plays as well. And I think that's something that Brampton really lacked, just kind of as we got deeper and deeper into that series, was aside from Porter Martone, Angus McDonnell, when he was healthy, obviously went down with an upper body injury and just couldn't battle through it. He was in a really tough spot, and it was tough to see him go through that, but he had a hat trick in game number 2 or game number 1 in that series. And then Carson Rakoff and Luke Misa, you take away those 4 guys, they really didn't get much from the rest of their forward group. And you got 8 other forwards on the roster. And over a 6-game series, I think it just showed, the depth of Oshawa was too much because the big guys were stacking up against the big guys. So how was your second, third, fourth line matching up against each other? And Oshawa was able to win that battle, and it kind of worked the same way in the Brantford series. Like once Nick Lardis went down, that's 71 goals. He had 25% of the team goals in the regular season. At the time he got injured, I believe it was 35% of their playoff goals. He had 11 of the 32, whatever number that works out to be. the Bulldogs scored 7 goals in the last 4 games. They really struggled to put the puck in, and a lot of really good creators, but they, truly missed that finisher, especially on the power play. Oshawa's penalty kill finished this series really strong. They went 13 of their last 15 on the penalty kill. Their power play finished really well, but I think in both those series, it's the depth of Oshawa that ended up being the difference maker. And when you get that depth goal to win a game, game number 4, which tied the series at 2 games apiece from Rogowski and Buckley, and you look back at the series now, I think that's ultimately where it ended. So I think, while Oshawa has that high end star power and a lot of it, right? You got Callum Ritchie, Beckett Seneca, Colby Barlow, Owen Griffin, who's been playing out of his mind, Noah Powell, Luke Torrance in the top 6. All of those guys can affect the game. Luca Morelli, Ben Danford, Luca D'Amato, Zach Sandu, Andrew Gibson, Simon Wang. All those guys can put up points from the back end. But I think it's the bottom 6 that really pushed the Oshawa Generals through the first 2 rounds, and really what were some tough matchups, 2 series where you could easily at the beginning of the year pinpointed those as Eastern Conference Finals instead of first and second round matchups.
I think it's easy for a lot of us to look at the NHL prospects like Seneca, like Ritchie, like Barlow, like Morelli, like Danford. I could keep listing them, but I don't want to, because you mentioned at the outset as one of the players with experience, and you just mentioned his name again, a guy that I made my prospect of the week twice in the final month of the season because I loved his second half and the way he came on towards the end of the season. Owen Griffin, 2 goals in the deciding game, including that empty netter. But this is a draft eligible player, Jack. What have you seen from Owen Griffin in terms of his trajectory this season heading into the June draft?
This isn't meant to be a put down towards anyone else. But from watching the 12 games that I've watched, Owen Griffin's been the best draft eligible player in each of those 12 games. And he just continues to skyrocket his stock. I think if you had talked to somebody in February and said, "What do you think, Owen Griffin?" He might get a rookie camp invite. Teams will keep an eye on him, see how his 18-year-old season goes. If they need to burn a draft pick on him, maybe that's what they do. But maybe an undrafted free agent signing down the stretch later in his career in the Ontario Hockey League. And then you got to March and he really started to come along. And I believe it was back on December 29th, Oshawa beat Kingston at home, and he scored his 6th goal of the year. That was game number 35 for Oshawa. So they played 33 games down the stretch. Griffin missed 2 or 3 of those games, and he finished with 16 goals down the stretch of the regular season, including a hat trick in game number 68, where that pushed him over the 50-point plateau. It put him up to 22 goals on the season. And now he's leading the team in playoff goals with 11. He's ahead of Barlow. He's ahead of Seneca. He's ahead of Ritchie in that category. And I think for me, watching him every day and watching him every game of his OHL career so far, you feel a little protective of him, because last year, obviously, the point numbers were struggling, but it was when he went to the U17s and he was playing on Team Canada and they were in the gold medal game and they were up by 1 against the Americans, and the Americans got a power play with under 3 minutes to go in the third period. And Owen Griffin and Tyler Hopkins from the Kingston Frontenacs were the 2 forwards who killed off most of that USA power play and ended up winning Canada a gold medal. And I think that's when it clicked for Oshawa. Like, if we put him into a third line center role, we have him kill penalties, and we really focus his development on the defensive side of the game, turning him into a shutdown center. How is he going to grow there? And then we don't have to worry about the points. We don't need him to put up 25, 30 points in his rookie season. We need him to shut down the other team's second line, which frees up our second line to go up against the other team's third line, and we're pretty comfortable with that. And I think from that moment, Owen, like, credit to him, he really bought into that mindset, and he became one of the best defensive forwards, not only on the team, but in the Eastern Conference and arguably the Ontario Hockey League that you saw down the stretch of last year. A lot of that carried over to this year, but you saw it at the beginning of the year. Game 1, there's no Seneca, no Ritchie, no Barlow, no Noah Powell. The top line for Oshawa is Sinavori, Griffin, and Buckley. And Owen Griffin has a 2-point game against the Kingston Frontenacs and a 3-2 win. And I remember calling the game, and there's 9 minutes to go in the third. We're tied at 2. And I'm standing there, and in my head, all I can think about is this might be the first time I've watched an Oshawa Generals game, and my mindset is put Owen Griffin on the ice. He's the guy with jump. He's the guy who's pushing the pace. And he's carried that all of the year. And he went through another stretch this year where he struggled to put up points. But then once they started to go for him, it just hasn't stopped. It's a leaky faucet. And nobody seems to be able to figure out how to turn it off.
You mentioned that OHL final last year, Oshawa gets swept, but there's no question that they came back this year on a mission, and that was to return and perform better, win the OHL championship. They go out early, make the deal for Barlow. The deadline's impactful, Andrew Gibson, etc. My broadcast partner, Jack, Paul Fixter, who's got a couple of Stanley Cup rings in his jewelry box, has said since we saw Oshawa the first time, this is the best built team he has seen in the East. So he was ahead of my curve, picking 2 series losses in these playoffs for Oshawa. What's this season been like, knowing, like you've known since the beginning too? The mission is a return to the OHL final and a different result this time. How has that shaped this season?
Yeah, well, I think early in the year, the expectations, right? Like last year, the expectations for Oshawa, and again, going back to the trade deadline in 2024, when Oshawa finishes it off, they get Sandu and Connor Punnett at the deadline. And I didn't do the games right before the trade deadline. I was off with the Toronto Marlies. So Adam Dunphy did an interview with Roger Hunt, and Roger Hunt comes in and he says, our goal this year is to win a round. We want to get the playoff experience. We want to get these guys through the first round of the playoffs, play as many playoff games as we possibly can because we know that we're building for next year. So Oshawa last year, a little ahead of the curve, right? Like I think you look at it last year going into the playoffs, Oshawa was the 1 seed, but Ottawa had built a team and struggled down the stretch of the season. They ended finishing sixth, but they beat the number 3 seed Brantford in the first round. North Bay was still that mega powerhouse that Oshawa had to win a 12th straight game just to edge out to get home ice in the Eastern Conference Final. So I think Oshawa, once they got past round one in Barrie, which was an incredibly difficult series for Oshawa, they went into round two. They had all these struggles. They hadn't picked up a win in Ottawa in 2 years. They really, really struggled against the 67s over the last 2 seasons, but they were able to move on in 4 in that series. And then the North Bay Battalion, it's just everywhere down the lineup you looked, it was, okay, that's a guy who could burn you. That's a guy who could burn you. That's a guy who could burn you. And all of a sudden, Oshawa's up 3-0 in the series, and you think it's kind of over. And 2 overtime games in games 4 and 5 send it to game 6, where the Battalion just blow Oshawa out of the water in game 6. And then it's a deciding game 7 where I would argue that Jacob Oster won that game in the first 45 seconds, not allowing North Bay to get on the board. They had 4 shots in the first 45 seconds of the game. They put Oshawa under a ton of pressure, and Oster was phenomenal. And then once the game settled down, the Generals could get to it. But that expectation was different last year. This year, the expectations have been there from day one. There was a sense that Colby Barlow was going to be an Oshawa General before the trade happened. You knew you were getting Beckett Seneca back. You were hoping you were getting Callum Ritchie back, but then you don't get Dylan Robrick back. Rasmus Kumpalainen goes away to the Finnish Pro League and plays in his hometown, and good for him. It's a great opportunity, but all of a sudden you started to find some holes in the roster, and how are you going to be able to fill those? And Oshawa gets Barlow, and then down the line, they get Simon Wang to come in and play on the back end instead of playing in the OJHL. And Oshawa really aided by that NCAA rule change in terms of that one, getting Ethan Martin. So they trade a depth 17-year-old forward to Windsor in Sean Costello to get a depth 19-year-old forward in Ethan Martin, who didn't play for the Windsor Spitfires when they went to the OHL Championship Series in his 16-year-old year, but he was a part of the team. He was around the team every day. And then you bring in Andrew Gibson from the Sault Ste. Marie Greyhounds, and you get a free agent signing in Noah Powell, and you pull him away from Ohio State University. And all of a sudden, now at the deadline, you bring in so many bodies, you have to find a way to make the puzzle all fit. And I think that's where Oshawa really struggled there was, okay, what's the role for everybody? Who can buy into these roles? Where are you best suited for this team? And I think down the stretch, maybe the last 2-3 games of the season, Oshawa really found that. But you guys saw him on February 11th until the first game of the playoffs. That was the last time the Oshawa Generals were fully healthy. Actually, not even. It was game 4 of the playoffs because Ethan Martin comes back from injury, but Harrison Franson's suspended. So Oshawa got their full lineup back midway through that first round series, and they were still trying to piece it all together. But once it clicked and once they found what they were able to do, the Generals were off and running. And, the expectations are heavy, but, those guys have known since the beginning of the year what the expectations are here. And for guys who have been there before and gotten close, there's a mindset to finish the job this year.
You're on that side of the league in the East, so you've seen these other teams more. I've looked at Barrie as a bit of an enigma much of the season. I love so many of the pieces, goaltending so strong, Kayshawn Aitchison, how could you not love him, et cetera, et cetera. And I think the story out of Kingston's been a lot of fun this season, including the attendance they've been getting in some of these second round games versus Barrie as they head to a game 7 as the guy who sees the East so much more and has seen more of these teams. How do you handicap that one, Jack?
It's really tough. I think you just look at Barry's roster, and when you look at the depth of it, Barrie and Oshawa look to be the two teams the deepest, top to bottom, in the Eastern Conference. But there's so much skill on Kingston, and what I really give Kingston credit to is how well coached they are. Troy Mann has done a phenomenal job with that team, and I think when you went into this series, you would handicap it as Barrie as a favorite because of the goaltending. But Charlie Shankles really figured it out for the Kingston Frontenacs. And then, kind of out of nowhere in game 3, Barrie put themselves in a goalie controversy of their own doing by switching it up. And they really haven't been able to get out of that. And Ben Horebic gets the start yesterday. He wasn't bad by any stretch of the imagination, but they lose. So do you go back to Sam Hillebrand? Do you go back to Ben Horebic? Two guys who have played well during the regular season, but now you're seeing their playoff numbers slip a little bit. So I like Barrie's depth, and I really like their top end skill. Obviously, they have that North Bay line of Van Steensel, Wakely, and Romani, on top of Emil Hemming and Riley Patterson and Bo Jelsma and Cole Bodwin. Like, it just seems everybody down the lineup, it's like, okay, that's a really good player, really good player, really good player. But when it comes to these one game situations, the structure of Kingston, I have a tough time, betting against them at this point because they just seem to find a way. And I think a lot of that stems from how good of a job Troy Mann is. And I know the coach of the year went to UC Ahokas this year, rightfully deserved. Jay McKee definitely deserved to be in that conversation. Greg Walters in Windsor does definitely deserve to be in that conversation. But a guy nobody talked about was Troy Mann and the season the Kingston Frontenacs had, at that end, and how good of a job he did. So, I really have a tough time picking this one. I really got to watch and see how that first period goes because I think that's going to be a little bit of a telltale sign. But if you asked me at the beginning of the series and you told me it was going 7, I would say Barrie. Right now, I'm right on the fence, and I have a tough time picking who it's going to be. I think Tuesday night's going to be a lot of fun on this side of the province. And I know I'm looking forward to watching the Kitchener Windsor game with the radio call on, in behind. But yeah, I'm staying away from picking that game because I just don't know how that's going to go.
I don't blame you. And game 7s, you might as well flip a coin no matter what. Just crazy stuff can happen. You and the Oshawa Generals last year, Jack, were in a game 7 in the East Final. It's the same script as we're watching in the Kitchener Windsor series right now. Gens get out to a 3-0 series lead. North Bay storms back to force a game 7. For those of us looking forward to watching a game 7 on Tuesday night, and those of us, hello, me, looking forward to being a part of one, take us through that for you. What it was like. East Final game 7. Flip that coin.
Well, it was almost easier doing game 6 because it was a 2 o'clock start where you're just up and you're ready to go. And, you get right to the rink, you set up your stuff, you get all your notes done, and it's like, okay, I got about 15 minutes just to walk this through. The nerves through the day on the Monday, I couldn't really focus on anything else. All my attention, all my mindset was on what's going to happen come 7 o'clock tonight. And my routine didn't really change. I show up to the rink, 3.5 to 4 hours before the game. I get set up, I get comfortable, I finish off writing off my notes. I go down to the coach's room for home games. I do an interview for the Jumbotron in the arena with the head coach. It was Derek Laxdal last year, who was the OHL Coach of the Year. And when you get into those situations, especially when, I'm in a situation where I work for the team, you're giving this message to the fans right before the game. You don't really want to talk about, hey, you had a 3-0 series lead. It's 3-3. It's game 7. Like, what's going on? It was, what's the message to the group? Um, you've been in this situation before in your coaching career. How do you bring that into this situation? And then the last question I asked was, are you ready? And then I asked that to the fans, and they, got pretty riled up, and the crowd was rocking, and just enjoying that experience, and trying to soak it all in. And I had to write on my boards, have fun, enjoy yourself. It's just a game, and not to get too involved in the emotion of it. You still got a job to do, and you got to call it. And that was my most listened to game of the year, and had a number of people from North Bay listen and reach out and give positive comments. And just once the game starts, I kind of always find the first 2 to 3 minutes of the game, I can figure out if I'm on or not. And North Bay tested me in that first 45 seconds where I wasn't even done describing the jerseys the teams that were wearing. And Justin Ertl had started a rush, and then Wakely and Romani and Van Steensel and Nelson had a shot from the point, and Oster's making all these crazy saves. And then North Bay didn't have another shot for 12 minutes after that. But once I got through that first 45 seconds and Oster covered the puck, I kind of took a breath, and I just went, all right, I'm ready for this one. I did about as good as I could on that sequence. I'm ready to go. This is going to be fun. And then Oshawa scores first. They get a 1-0 lead. David Bedkowski now at the Owen Sound attack. He was a part of that Colby Barlow trade. And then, Oshawa ended up winning it 6-1. But just enjoying it, enjoying the atmosphere. Everybody's on edge. Everybody's nervous. And just to try and be that calm, cooling presence of, fans at home that are listening and not watching on TV. When they're listening to the radio call, they might be on edge. So if you're too over the top, it might push them further. So you need to be that calm, cool, collected presence there, and just, be the voice of reason, and be air traffic control, and keep everybody calm for those 3 hours while you're on the air. And then once it's over and Oshawa won it, you can enjoy it. If you lose it, it's probably the worst feeling that you could ever have. But last year, Oshawa was lucky to come out on the right side of it. And you're going to feel really good for the two teams that win tomorrow night, but the two teams that lose, that have big aspirations for this season, it's going to be a tough pill to swallow. So, keeping that respect for the opponents as well. I mean, North Bay, that was their third trip to the Eastern Conference Final, back-to-back years losing in Game 7. Paul Christopoulos, that was his 300th game in the OHL between the regular season and the playoffs. And you just feel for those guys, but just enjoying the moment and trying to do your job as best as possible, and hopefully the result goes in the favor that you're hoping for.
I'm going to take that advice from you into my broadcast on Tuesday night. I'm going to write down air traffic controller on my game sheet so I remember.
That's all you can do, right? I'm the same way. I get overly emotional about it. I grew up in the Durham region. My first Generals game, I saw John Tavares play at the old Civic. I saw a number of games at the old Civic before the team moved to what is now Tribute Community Center. So I have, a lifelong investment in this team. I work for the team. I spend a lot of time with the players and the coaches, and, you just cheer so hard. And I know, you don't necessarily work for the team on your side, but, you have that connection emotionally to the team. And you got to remember that everybody listening does too. And you just got to make sure that you're that calming presence, and making sure you're calling the game as best as possible. But, I listen to you and Paul all the time on the radio, and you guys do a phenomenal job. So I'm not worried about how you guys handle Game 7 tomorrow night.
We do a phenomenal job, even when the over-the-top play-by-play announcer says that a player should have run a goalie just as payback from something else that happened earlier in the game.
I messaged you after you said that, and you came back from break and you were like, I shouldn't have said that. That was wrong. I apologize. And my message to you was, I would have come back from break and said he should have done it again. Do it at the commercial, So it is what it is. Again, it's why people love, there's people who hate the homers because they're not on that side, but there's people who love it because that's how they feel about their team, and they want to hear that emotion from you as well because they want the team just to win as bad as you do. So yeah, no, I love listening to you and Paul. Every chance I get, I have you guys on, and no question about it, I'm going to have you guys on tomorrow night.
Exactly like you, Jack. Growing up in Kitchener, going to the Memorial Auditorium with my dad, watching the players, Brian Bellows, Jeff Larmer, Scott Stevens, like Al McInnes. It goes on and on and on. I'm a lifelong fan. I'm a Kitchener boy. I can only be so impartial. But as you point out, my checks are signed by Rogers Media, not the Kitchener Rangers. Listen, I've kept you long, but before I let you go, I hope you'll indulge me in a favor. Earlier this season, it's a tragedy that you're in Oshawa, I'm in Kitchener. We only cross over one time. But one of our conversations, you uh, had a conversation with me, and you asked me a question, and I still have nightmares about the way I fumbled and stumbled through it. And I want a second chance. I want a do over from the conversation we had when you came to Kitchener. Are you willing to indulge?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. I promise I'll make it quick, but you asked a question about my favorite Don Cameron memory, a Don Cameron story that your audience needed to hear. And I'd never been asked that before, Jack. And I hadn't given it any thought. And in the heat of the moment, it was some stupid story about us enjoying beverages on the road, not the story that I think should have been told. So if you'll indulge me, two quick ones here. Don would have turned 89 last week when the Rangers won their first game in this playoff series. Two quick stories for you. The '08 Memorial Cup. Kitchener hosts. They lose on home ice to Spokane. The Chiefs are out there celebrating. They get the Memorial Cup awarded to them. They pick it up and it breaks in pieces. The base falls off and goes crashing to the ice. And Don Cameron, I'm standing right beside him in the broadcast booth. He says, "Oh my God, they broke the trophy." And then, much like the story you just described from me coming back from commercial break and apologizing, we didn't go to commercial. After a few more seconds, Don apologized for his outburst because Don Cameron, such a deeply religious man, couldn't believe he said, "Oh my God," on the air. It had to be an "oh my gosh" or something else. That's number one. The other one that you have to know is the day I got a call about a half hour before I usually go to the rink. And the call came from Danny Liebold, the Rangers head trainer. "Mike, where are you?" I said, just get ready to come to the rink. He says, "When you get here, come straight to my room and see me." Okay. So I get to Dan's trainer's room, and there's Don Cameron on the trainer's table with blood coming down from his forehead. I'm like, what on earth is going on? Don took a fall, cut his head open, and needed 14 stitches. Don was beside himself, not because of the stitches, not because of the blood, but because we had a game to do. I said, "Don, you're in good hands here. I'm going to take care of the prep work for the game, et cetera, et cetera." And whatever. I do a couple of extra interviews to get us ready for broadcast. That man, and he was in his 70s at the time of this happening, was in the booth to call the game. As always, he did the game standing up. He didn't sit down. He 14 stitches to the squash, as head coach Mike Van Ryn said at the time, called the whole game. And it was my job after the game to check in on Don every 2 hours, concussion protocol, just make sure he's okay. So Danny Liebold says, make these calls every 2 hours. Just ask Don something about the game. Who'd they play? What was the score? Just to make sure he's got some recall. So I faithfully go about that. We part ways about 10 o'clock, midnight the call, 2 o'clock the call. And by the time I called him at 4 o'clock in the morning, he just picked up the phone and said, "Rangers won the game 4-3 on a late goal by so," and that was like, "Okay, Don, you're okay. I'll see you at the next game." 70 whatever years old, 14 stitches to the head, still called the game. Those are the Don Cameron stories that should have been told.
I love that. And I only have my one, right? Like, and I feel like I need to share it every time. And I said the same thing when Oshawa played London this year at home because the first game between those two teams was so crazy. And I had a conversation with Mike Stubbs earlier in the week for his show, and I said, I was like, this is a situation where you love that these two teams only play twice in a year, once at home, once on the road, because it feels like this game has more buildup than a regular, Oshawa playing Kingston for the sixth time, Oshawa playing Peterborough for the sixth time. Same with Kitchener and Guelph sometimes, and Kitchener and Owen Sound. So when I only get to go to the odd once a year, when I spend so much time in that building, did over 100 games between hockey and basketball in that building to start out my career. Um, when I walked in, I was filling in on TV as the rinkside host for Game 6, Western Conference Final, and somebody had to sell beer, so he couldn't call the game, and Don Cameron has to step in on 570, and um, I always appreciated walking into the Don Cameron media room, reading the plaque. It was my first year. I was 20 years old, filling in and just appreciate the history of it. And I walk in and Don's sitting underneath his plaque. And he shook my hand and he said, "You're the young man who fills in on TV. You do a great job." And I know he's at most of the games, if not all the games. He's probably never seen me, but to go out of his way and say that, he got an overtime winning call for his last call with the Kitchener Rangers to send him to Game 7. And unfortunately, we lost him shortly thereafter that summer. But that's my one Don Cameron story. And I have to share it with my audience every time I'm in that building just to appreciate the history of who Don was, who he means not only to Kitchener and the city and the team, but to the Ontario Hockey League as a whole. And so I felt I needed to ask you about that. I should have gave you a warning on it, but I'm glad we got to do a retell here.
I should have done a better job. No, nothing on your end. And Don sitting in that media room would have thought nothing about the plaque that he was sitting beneath, right? He was just in it. He was just in the media room having his cup of coffee, waiting for the game to start.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly, and that's who he was. But he did a great job that game, and Cole Sherwood gave him a good one to go out on.
He got to call the last Rangers win of that season, and then he passed in that offseason. And by the way, just one more point. That guy that begged off the game because he had to sell beer, it was for charity. It was for charity, Moore. Come on.
Sorry, I never got. I told you I was new. That was my first season. All I knew is Mike couldn't make the game because he's got a beer that he's got to go and sling around KW. So he's got to miss Game 6 of the Western Conference Final.
Oh my goodness, the things that we have been through, I'll tell you. Jackson, you're a beauty. I really appreciate you stepping up for the pod this week and wishing you the best of luck in the East Final against whichever team comes through, Kingston or Barrie. It's going to be a great series. And hey, who knows? At some point down the road, we might meet in an OHL final instead of just those stupid once per time crossing over to your side or my side.
Yeah, exactly. Well, hopefully that's sooner rather than later, and I hope the Rangers can take care of business tomorrow night. But an Oshawa kid and Liam Greentree, I always got to cheer for that kid too.
All right, hang in there. Your performer of the week, even though Dan's not here. I think Jack Moore might be my performer of the week, but that is also still to come on this week's episode of the OHL podcast. Just want to go a little bit further on something Jack and I touched on when talking about that Barrie Kingston series in the East. Game 4 in that series. Yeah, it was a Thursday night, headed into a long weekend, but way to go, Limestone City. 5,400 at Slush Puppy Place to watch that game, and Kingston won it big, putting up 9 goals in that one. They've kind of reverted to the median, if you will, or the mean in Kingston since, but they're at more than 3,000 announced anyway, attendance. It's a great building in a great city. I don't know what the stumbling block has been getting people into that arena to watch the Kingston Frontenacs. Great team this year and all set for that big game 7. But kudos to the fans who showed up in the numbers they showed up, 53-99 for game 4 as Kingston tied that series 2-2, and now it's 3-3 headed for those two best words in all of sports, game 7. Of course, we're going to finish with your prospect, or it's performer of the week now, Farwell. Get your head on straight. Performer of the week in the playoffs. The prospects are done. I talked about Owen Griffin in that last segment with Jack. Was my prospect of the week a couple of times in the final month of the regular season. Dan and I, throughout the season, take a look at the players that we think, well, that have caught our attention, really, who are draft eligible. Now that we're into the playoffs, we do the performer of the week. And I know at this point, it feels like ancient history to recognize this player as my performer of the week because it's basically a full week ago. It was game 3 between the Kitchener Rangers and the Windsor Spitfires. And yes, that's 4 games ago, and lots has happened. But anytime you can be the guy who breaks not just a franchise record, but one that was held by Ernie Godden. You'll remember Ernie Godden's name came up on this podcast not too long ago. His 89-goal regular season, still the most goals ever scored in a season by an OHL player. Dare I say unbreakable, but when Dan was here, he said, "No, I'm gonna predict it can be broken because that's what happens to records." But Ernie Godden has cemented his status in OHL history for more than 4 decades now with that 89-goal regular season. But his franchise, Windsor Spitfires franchise mark of 4 goals in a playoff game, bested by none other than Liam Greentree, who scored 5 and had an assist in Windsor's Game 3 win over the Kitchener Rangers to take that 3-0 series lead. And I know not only is it 4 games and a week ago and so many other performances, etc., but you're going to say, yeah, but now the Spits have coughed up a 3-0 series lead. I don't know why. I mean, I guess I get why we look at it that way, because you've got just one more game to win and you can move on in the series. But if you think about it from a slightly higher level here, Windsor won 3 games in a row, and then Kitchener won 3 games in a row. Each team has won 3 games in a row. Now we go to a game 7 and we flip a coin, and we'll see which way that coin lands. But Liam Greentree, with his 5-goal playoff game performance, is my performer of the week. And he, with 14 goals in this postseason, leads them all, and it's not even really close. 11 is the next best, his teammate Noah Morneau and Nick Lardis, who is now out of the playoffs. But Greentree's performance in that game and really in these playoffs has been something to behold. But Liam Greentree gets my nod as the performer of the week. Enjoy those game 7s. They don't come around all that often. They're a lot of fun. No matter which side you come out of it on, I hope you enjoy the experience of your game 7. And I hope you're okay without Dan Mahar with us this week on the OHL podcast. Dan will be back next week. We'll be here every Tuesday right through the Memorial Cup and into the NHL draft, because that's what we do here on the OHL podcast.